China wants to be the linchpin behind a new BRICS currency, the first detour, the first stop on that road is going to be an open capital count, which means that you're probably going to see the yuan go to double digits. So what really is the point? Why do I even care about swapping into renminbi if I can't, convert it and get out of it if I want to?
This is The Global Gambit. Welcome back, everybody. So on this episode, we're going to be talking China, and we're going to be talking specifically about currencies and a little bit about the BRICS. And with me to discuss some matters relating to China, what he calls the Donkey Kong dollar peg in one of his cowboy musings, which will be linked in the description, as well as just a few broader macro economic issues. Michael, welcome to the Global Gambit.
Great. Thanks for having me. We've been talking about doing this for a while.
We have, and I don't blame you for wanting your summer break. But to dive straight in, so you wrote a pretty interesting article about a month ago, exactly a month ago, actually, to the day, bar tomorrow, called USD/China, the Donkey Kong dollar peg. Now, I'm not an intricate expert on the musings of financial matters, but I am interested in the macroeconomics of it. But I guess for me and some of us who are less in the know, what I'd be interested to know from you is what was the primary focus of the article, which people can find on Substack, and could you break it down for us a little bit more now?
Sure. So that article is actually the sequel to an earlier piece that I wrote called Ball in a China Shop that goes back to March. So if you recall, in March, what was grabbing everybody's attention was the regional banking crisis. But I wrote a piece called, Ball in a China Shop, referring specifically to what I call the US dollar wrecking ball, and saying that, look, I think the regional banking crisis will get solved, but I think the much bigger issue facing the world from a potential deflationary pulse perspective is what's going on with China, because as you probably know, I follow the geopolitics and of oil quite a lot because I've had a long-term private equity bet in oil, so I follow it very, very closely. And one of the things that people got wrong about China in late 2022 was this whole great reopening trade. And I think what we're seeing in China and the breathtaking really collapse of all of its economic metrics at the same time is what I call this constructive interference of short-term and long-term cycles. So if you know how noise-canceling headphones work, just to allow me a quick digression for a powerful mental model. Noise-canceling headphones basically sample the ambient noise, right? And then they basically generate a signal that's exactly 180 degrees out of phase to cancel out that noise. So that's a process called destructive interference, and that's what we are actually seeing here in the United States. Because on the one hand, we've got these long-term structural, secular, demographic tailwinds that are keeping shelter and labor inflation sticky, but the Fed is trying to engineer a shorter cycle economic headwind to counteract the inflation. So it's giving this destructive interference is canceling each other out, and it's giving us what I call the illusion of a Goldilocks situation. I think ultimately the Fed will win and will break something. Now, what could the Fed break? I think it's probably going to break China. It's already happening because in China, you have the opposite situation. You've got a constructive interference where as of 2 or 3 years ago, Evergrande went bust, right? And its property bubble burst. And I'll call that the short-term economic headwinds, right? It's a cyclical phenomenon. But unlike Japan in the 1990s, as Richard Koo pointed out on a recent Odd Lots podcast, unlike Japan, where its property bubble burst in 1990 and then its demographics didn't peak for another 19 years, in China's situation, it peaked at the same time. And so I think what you're seeing is this compounding of a longer term secular demographic structural downturn constructively interfering with this more cyclical collapse in its property sector. When I wrote the update on the recently in that Donkey Kong dollar peg, I was referring specifically to the soft peg of the Chinese yuan to the dollar and the hard peg of the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar, and I collectively called the two the Donkey Kong dollar peg because as a play on words on the Hong Kong part, and also if you remember that game from the 80s, right, on level 4, Mario could once he knocks out the rivets, he sends Donkey Kong crashing on his head. And so the rivets here are that so now I'm going to mix metaphors and I'm going to go to my other favorite area that I draw on, which is Greek mythology. I call this the Scylla Charybdis trap, the Scylla and Charybdis trap of the PBOC, right? Because if you think of the PBOC as Odysseus trying to brave the strait of the Scylla and the Charybdis, it's facing two very, very unpalatable choices. On the one hand, you've got the Scylla monster of a weak currency, which invites the importing of commodity inflation. As we all know, China imports 80 to 90% of its oil, which is all dollar-based. And then on the other side of the spectrum, a relatively strong currency obviously hurts its export engine. And as we all know, China's economy is primarily, despite their every effort at creating a consumer class that really just has not happened. All of its economic growth miracle has been essentially centrally dictated, and with a lot of roads to nowhere and ghost cities, and so that leaves only one safety valve, if you will, for it to essentially export out of its mess. And the only way it can do that is to weaken the currency, right? So in right around the time that I wrote that Ball in a China Shop article in March, shortly thereafter, around that time, I had been short-term bearish on commodities, and commodities had a pretty rough go the last couple of months, despite the recent uptick. And I said, look, all things being equal, between the commodity crash and the stockpiling that China has done at our expense, mind you, we've been emptying our SPR, they've been building their SPR. All things being equal, that makes the Scylla monster that much more palatable, right? One would think that the PBOC, when having to choose between two very unattractive outcomes, probably gravitates towards the road of weaker yuan. So that's what prompted me to write the update. I myself, I've been short the Chinese yuan around the 685 level since March. I recently, in the name of full disclosure, around like 725 or so, I had been short the Chinese yuan and the Hong Kong dollar, but I basically swapped out of the last bit of my Chinese yuan short into Hong Kong dollar because, to me, at 735 was the intervention level in October or November of 2022. And the PBOC back then intervened rather aggressively. Even recently, as maybe like 2 months ago, you saw the PBOC intervene at like 722, drive it all the way down to 711. So I see that as a near-term possibility. That's increasing because it does seem like, at least based on the other monetary stimulus measures that the PBOC has taken. I mean, they have been, you forget about a bazooka. I call this a 22 caliber plinker or a pea shooter, right? This week, they lowered the loan prime rate by 10 basis points. So it, to me, it kind of tells me that maybe the PBOC is kind of unserious about real stimulus, and that their efforts to stymie the weakening in the yuan might be greater than I originally thought. So,
yeah, no, I want to jump in there because you've essentially read your entire Article 4, which I think is an incredible achievement.
Right.
And now people don't need to now people don't need to read it, but if they want, it is linked above in the Twitter Spaces and linked below in the description of the YouTube channel. But I want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about the distinctions between the short term and the longer structural systemic risks that you mentioned, because being a China watcher myself, in the broader scheme of great power competition, one of the things I look at is the China demographics. So one of the things you mentioned was about how the US is, if the US hadn't flooded its economy with fiscal and monetary stimulus like it did, we'd be facing a similar situation to the Chinese. So I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit more how you think that would play out in China's capacity. And if you want to bring in some of the deeper systemic aspects of the demography, do so. Because I do think that is something that a lot of people do not take enough accountancy for. When they sort of talk about, the West is dead, end of the dollar, and all this sort of rhetoric, it's not accounting enough for, as you said, Evergrande as well. That was another question I had for you, but you've basically answered them all. So I'm now running on the fly of trying to think of questions to ask you.
I mean, look. I think on the COVID response, I think one of the biggest mistakes that people made with respect to the big reopening call at the end of the year was to view CCP economic policy through a Western lens, right? The CCP, ironically, doesn't really care about its consumer, and you could just tell through its zero COVID response. It's as if, imagine if the U.S. had locked down for an additional 18 months and did not flood the system with monetary stimulus, and did not flood it with fiscal stimulus, and instituted a three red lines policy to curb property speculation to boot. That's what you have with China. And so that, and that's, by the way, that all feeds into that short-term downward cyclical headwind that I'm talking about. The demographic headwind is a much bigger issue, and I think it's harder to quantify, but it clearly, I think it informs why despite their efforts at creating a consumer-driven economy, it just hasn't happened and will not happen. It's probably impossible for it to happen.
So one of the other things that I think is of note in all of this is obviously when we listen to people, I have gotten in debates with this in our own time on Spaces about the China versus US stability and conditions, is about the debt. And obviously, debt is not good. But I remember seeing a graphic, I believe it was on Twitter or X just the other day, which was illustrating that China's debt is pretty significant as well. So what's your opinion in that regard when people bring up the fact that, the US shouldn't have spent all of that amount because now the debt is just X, Y, and Z level, and how this plays into the overall economic conditions?
See, I actually first started writing about China, not even this March, but last March, when I was debating someone who shall remain nameless on Twitter about the dollar. This someone is always saying that the dollar is doomed, and look at China. The yuan is at sick. At that point, the yuan was around like 6.25, 6.5, and he was basically pointing that out as like the yuan as like the singular source of strength, and its balance sheet is so much better than ours. And I pushed back pretty hard, and I said, "Look, wait a second. The central balance sheet of the PBOC is a facade, because if you look at the Byzantine way in which China has financed itself, it has used all of these off-balance sheet vehicles through its SOEs, its LGFVs, all these funding vehicles that are essentially, these are shenanigans that would make Enron blush. It's Enron writ large at a sovereign level. And so if at some point that kind of Ponzi finance is going to come to a head, and it usually Ponzi's fail when capital becomes scarce, and the inflow of the new suckers starts to grind down to a trickle, and it forces a mark to market, right? And I think we're on the precipice of that moment of reckoning. It's again, with China's situation, the opacity of its financing mechanisms makes it tough to determine exactly when that Minsky moment is. But I'll say that we're definitely a lot closer than we are 10 years ago, because you're starting to see Evergrande, now Country Garden, a lot of its One Belt One Road debt. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit, but Brad Setzer has made some waves on Twitter writing about China could have potentially 3 trillion shadow reserves. Well, I don't know whether or not that is the case or not, but I know that some of these other assets are probably not that liquid when you consider its very, very mixed record in the One Belt One Road projects. I don't know if that's included in the shadow reserves, but those are not liquid, and those are probably not going to recover anywhere close to par.
Interesting. Okay, so one thing I would also want to build on that then is, well, generally to your point about the BRICs. I mean, again, I think this is one of these points that people seem to have struggled distinguishing between, which is when you're sort of disagreeing with something, it's not because you necessarily discredit what they're saying. I mean, about the propensity for countries to want to get more involved with the BRICs, for example, or the BRI. But when we see vanity projects like the one that was built in Sri Lanka, for example, that massive tower that had no actual economic commerce. I can't remember the amount of
the Hambantota, you mean?
Yes, I believe so.
Hambantota.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So examples like that, and generally the Argentinians have been, how much of the Chinese had to give to them in additional loans because of issues they've had. So generally the BRI is not going as, I think, well as the Chinese would have liked to say it is. But then to jump over to, you said 10 years ago, things were different. And 10 years ago, we had South Africa join the BRICs. And that is something that I do want to discuss a little bit with in the context of your article, which is that at the moment we have the BRICs meeting. President Xi is in China, in South Africa. Now, one of the biggest, I think...
See that President Xi somehow missed the meeting?
I did not, no.
He wasn't there. I just saw that on Twitter. Yeah. I don't know. Bonnie Glazer pointed that out. Like, okay, he's in South Africa, but he didn't show up. Anybody know why?
Okay. Well, we'll have to dig into that. But I
don't know.
Well, at least he made an effort to get to the country, unlike Putin, for his potential arrest. But just on the BRICs, then, one of the biggest things is about for the Chinese to conduct, more trade and engagement with countries on a bilateral basis off the dollar. How do you, one, as a sub question, see that? But two, what do you think about the propensity for China to do that, given its currency situation and all the factors that we've touched upon? How do you think that plays into the decision-making, the strategical thinking of the CCP, the PBOC, and so on, when they want to increasingly, reduce distance on the US? Dependency.
I mean, look, I think talk of alternatives to the US dollar have been going on for decades. One of the things that I co-presented a paper at West Point in February, and the title of the paper was "US Dollar Primacy in an Era of Economic Warfare." The first part of the paper talked about how the rise of the euro dollar system basically came about organically. It came about long before, probably 15 years before the so-called 1971 Nixon shock. So it was basically the world organically choosing US dollars as an alternative, a safer, more liquid alternative to the pound sterling, at a time when the pound sterling instituted capital controls to combat its own inflation problem. interestingly, capital controls come up, right? And illiquidity comes up. So what do you got going on with the Chinese yuan? Well, it's got a closed capital account. So in my mind, if China wants to be the linchpin behind a new BRICS currency, the first detour, the first stop on that road is going to be an open capital account, which means that you're probably going to see the yuan go to double digits. I think that's probably where it naturally goes to. If they actually fully open their capital account, which is why I like to be short both that and the Hong Kong dollar. I wrote, so on the BRICS thing, look, I'll summarize. First, I'll talk about just the acronym BRICS, and then I'll talk about the bigger picture. I summarized BRICS, my thought on BRICS, with a tongue-in-cheek tweet a couple of months ago, and I said, look, here's the problem. You've got R and I not liking each other. You remember that episode where the Russians said, we don't want your rupees, and India said, we don't want your rubles? Well, R and I don't like each other anymore, okay? I and C have never liked each other. They've honestly had a history of border disputes. And then R and C are only in this marriage, this tryst of convenience. And it's only a tryst because if you think about it, Mao did not like being Stalin's bitch, and Putin doesn't like being Xi's bitch. Okay, so there, and so if R, I, and C all don't really get along, that just leaves BS, and that's how I feel about the whole BRICS thing. Because look, BRICS was coined, as we all know, by Jim O'Neill. I hate it when people talk about how, the economies of the BRICS nations eclipses that of the G7, blah, 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 blah. It's irrelevant because this is you can take any arbitrary collection of countries and make a similar claim. But is there any sort of glue holding these countries together? Zero. Now this BRICS, this new initiative, though, suggests that they're going to try to come up with a new alternative to the dollar, commodity-based alternative. Well, that sounds great, but why not just go straight to gold then? Why is there even this fiat convertibility angle? I mean, if you go back to the origins of Bretton Woods, I mean, there were suggestions for these baskets even back then. In April, I wrote a piece on my Substack called "BRICs a Brack," and obviously another play on words. I'm very fond of plays on words.
You're really loving these play on words, aren't you?
That's right. That's right. But I in that piece, which I encourage listeners to go take a look at, I actually detailed a lot of the reasons why I think a BRICS type of currency is doomed to failure. And I also, by the way, we talked a little bit about China's One Belt, One Road. In there, I actually went into some detail about the various failed initiatives of China's in that regard, and talk about its various sort of Strait of Malacca hedges, if you will. So that's a very detailed piece that I would point people to. I'm definitely not losing sleep over BRICS challenging the U.S. dollar's hegemony, because what the U.S. dollar has that no other currency has, even the euro, is that it's got a deep liquid bond market. It's got tremendous adoption, mainly because of its elasticity, right, of supply. It's got rule of law, and of course, okay, the people are going to challenge me on that and say, "Oh, but the Treasury Department and OFAC sees Russian reserves, etc." Well, but okay, let's talk about that for a second. It's not as if the U.S. Treasury is going around willy-nilly and just seizing people's reserves. You had a situation here where one country invaded another country. So I guess if you are a dictator planning to invade another country, perhaps like Xi, maybe you would be concerned. right? But if you are a law-abiding sovereign citizen, why would you be concerned? Would you be better off in terms of your ability to sleep at night in entrusting your central bank reserve to something overseen by either Xi or Putin? I don't think so.
So let's jump a bit more to what you were saying about the BRI as well, because I think that is something worth exploring given the current circumstances. When we had James Palmer on the show, Deputy Editor of Foreign Policy, it was just as we were seeing the reopening of China, and he was talking about the existential risks that really were plaguing the Chinese economy. I'd forgotten the term before, but I remembered it now, and it's the swap lines. These are essentially when the Chinese central bank tells any other currency that they convert as much of their currency as they want into renminbi. Argentina has done this, I think, 8 times in the past 8 years. Been done by, I think, over 40 countries. Moreover, the BRI, as I said earlier in our conversation, has its limitations, I think, because China's had to bail out about 20 of the countries that have essentially signed up to it, and delayed or restructured about $230 billion worth of loans. So, going forward, as China does enter, I think this phase of a more advanced economy, given China's issues that we've been talking about domestically, how do you think that those are going to seep into its economic policy internationally, and if it does want to be seen as a reliable or credible guarantor, creditor, whatever, for other countries through the BRI? I
feel like as a very, very minimum step, if you want to make the availability of swap lines even credible, then you have to have an open capital account and make your currency freely convertible. So what's really the point, right? I mean, so what really is the point? Why do I even care about swapping into renminbi if I can't, convert it and get out of it if I want to?
Succinct. I like it. But my last question for you, Michael, is then, we'll focus mainly on the macro, but, as individuals who are following this and trying to make financial decisions, informed decisions, what would you say people should keep a lookout for in the short to medium term, or for the last, quarter and a bit?
Broader macro or China specifically?
Well, let's do both in that case. Let's do a two-parter, if you so wish.
Well, looking back to how we opened this conversation with my mental model of like the short-term cycles and long-term cycles, right? So again, if you think about going back to the Fed's headache right now is trying to override that longer-term demographic tailwind to inflation with a monetary economic headwind. Okay, its difficulty is. I go back to this demographic pyramid chart that I borrowed from Peter Zeihan, where when you look at the U.S. demographic pyramid, it's quite interesting because I see a current trough in around the sort of the 40 to 55 year old trough, which I'll call the most highly tenured part of the labor force, right? That might explain why we have such a tight labor market. And then at the same time, you have a peak of people in the 30 to 39-year-old bucket. 30 to 39 is significant because that's prime household formation, home buying age. And that perhaps is keeping shelter inflation artificially sticky as well, right? So for the Fed to actually break inflation, it has to break the U.S. consumer. To break the U.S. consumer, it really has to damage the labor market and cause job losses. And mind you, the delta between the current U.S. unemployment rate of 3.5% to call it 4.5% is not a loss of like 200,000 jobs. We're talking like 1.5 million jobs. We're nowhere near that yet. And so that causes the Fed to, I think, we will learn more about what they're going to say this week in Jackson Hole. But I think they are going to be higher for longer. And with respect to the U.S., the implications on the macro and the U.S. dollar wrecking ball, I think the question to ask is no longer who is going to out-hawk the Fed, but who is going to out-dove the Fed. Because there is no other consumer in the world right now, including the European consumer, that can literally match the strength in aggregate of the U.S. consumer. And so I think my thesis, at least, is that every central bank around the world has been hoping upon hope for the Fed to conquer inflation globally so that they don't need to administer their own medicine. But if you actually look at it, China and Japan never stopped stimulating, right? So that's why their currencies are down so much. You're seeing Latin America start to throw in the towel with its first spate of big interest rate cuts, and I think the real big shoe to fall potentially is Europe. I think the European economy, especially when you look at Germany, has also fallen off a cliff. I just saw this headline today about how the BOE, I believe it's the BOE, expecting that by year end, as many as 50% of corp businesses are going to be experiencing some level of debt stress. So I've been saying for the last several months now that the U.S. dollar wrecking ball has been hiding in plain sight. And what I mean by that is that you can't really see it manifest in the DXY because the DXY is 60% the euro, and the euro has actually held on. But I don't think that's going to last. The U.S. dollar wrecking ball has already wrecked Asia, but you can't really see it in the DXY. The DXY has rebounded from par to like 103.5. But if Christine Lagarde basically folds, and I think she will fold long before the Fed folds, the euro goes back down to 100 to 105 in a heartbeat, and DXY jumps closer to 110. And then you have a real wrecking ball.
Michael, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you on. For everyone watching on the channel, thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider subscribing and sharing the video. You'll find some more stuff above here, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. As always, it wouldn't be possible without my patrons like Matt, and take care.